Kenny MacAskill. Aye, 5 years loading Findus fish fingers and Lang's made ice cream every summer. See where it gets you. Can I start with some of the procedural matters? Because obviously Neil and I operate as a tag team in the Westminster ring, one in, one out. But when we're out, there's lots of work to be done. And obviously a question was raised with the General Secretary about finance, and he correctly answered it, and it was correct to ask him. It is important. These things are not simply technical. I do chair, as he said, the Finance and Audit Committee. We did meet earlier this week. We did question him. We did peruse the accounts. We are satisfied. There is no camper van in the accounts or anywhere else, nor will there be, though I do know that some people think it would be handy given the price of hotels, I'm told, this weekend in Inverness. But we can be light-hearted and jocular about that, but it's important because I was a national treasurer of the SNP. Many of us were in the SNP. We left the SNP because of policies, some of which were frankly wrong, if not perverse, some of which they were bereft of, but were core to the party and the reason that we had joined. But it was more than simply policies. It was about probity, because let me be quite clear, it is appropriate for Fiona and any other member of Alba to question the Executive, the General Secretary and anybody else about our finance. And also that any party, especially a government party, should not only be seeking to get Scotland's constitutional future correct, but they should be ensuring that they stand by the tenor of their own constitution. Something is fundamentally wrong, not only in policies, but in probity in the government party of Scotland. But there's also an arrogance. Last week, I got an email in from a magazine. They were asking for 700 words for a column. Would I write one? And I said, well, I'm happy to. And they told me, the editor, he said he had been asking the SNP, but they had been blocked. Now, this is a magazine that does in rotation, Labour, Tories, Liberal Democrats. He said since the internal election for the new First Minister, some SNP members individually had broken ranks, but he had had no cooperation from the SNP. This wasn't some of the obscure left-wing magazines that I write for, or Declassified UK that the SNP run from. This, ladies and gentlemen, was fishing news. Fishing news. Not angling, but fishing. Now, you think about the history of the SNP and indeed of the nationalist movement, how important the fishing industry in the northeast and the north of Scotland was, and the Scottish Government Party doesn't seem to think it's worth providing 700 words for them. Well, I was happy to oblige, because I pointed out in my column, and without prejudging the debate that we're going to be having on HPMAs, I pointed out that I walked my dog round Dunbar Harbour quite often. And Dunbar Harbour, late at night, they're unloading the boats and they're preparing them for the following day. And it's the same in Port Seton and Cockenzie. It's not the glory days of when Fisher Row was renowned across the country, when Dunbar, Port Seton and Cockenzie were bustling ports, but these men and women, they work hard. The industry's changed. There's new challenges because I've had to intervene to hold the jerseys, because as they lay the cabling and do the sonar work for the offshore wind, it's affecting those who work in fishing. They've got rights as well, despite the fact that we do need this offshore wealth, as I'll come on to. And also remember the history of Scottish fishing, and I've written about that, because not only did I see it now in Dunbar, but I used to go up every summer, as I said to the editor, to the Western Isles. You can deduce from my name where my father's parents came from. And it grieves me when I see this flight of Stornoway. A marina is no alternative for what was a bustling fishing port and a bustling fishing community. And it wasn't just Stornoway. Wee villages in Lewis and Harris had their own ports and their own ships that went out sailing from them. But of course, what happened? The world did change in many ways. We joined the then common market. Spanish trawlers and others came into the sea lochs. They scooped out with nets that were illegal. They destroyed the fishing grounds. Our people's rights were sold out by the British government, not simply taken by Brussels. And that continued, because I can remember when the Klondikers came in and fishermen in Ullapool were flying the flag of Canada, because Canada was standing up for its fishing industries when the UK was neglecting them and selling them out. But at that time, we had no Scottish Parliament. Had we had a Scottish Parliament, we said we would never have allowed our fishing rights to be sold out as they were to the common market. When the Klondikers were coming in, we'd have said no Scottish Parliament. We'd have allowed the Klondikers in with impunity and not stand up for the Scottish fishing industry. What have we got now? Not only will they not contribute 700 words once a quarter or even once a month to fishing news, they won't stand up in the danger to the communities that are left that have been bereft in Lewis, Harris and elsewhere across the coasts of mainland Scotland. The danger is this isn't being done by Brussels. It's not being done by Westminster. It's being done by the SNP Green Coalition because it's part of the Butte House Agreement. Because it's part of the Butte House Agreement, the same as we had to soak up what Brussels imposed upon us, we've got to soak up what Wallner Slater and the Greens want to damage the existing communities. We've been working away, and Neil referred to the Valaris 121, this offshore supply ship for the offshore industry, where a lad from Wales sadly lost his life. I've been working closely with the RMT, a union that are friends to this party, as we know, and who we should never forget in their time of need, which is why I'm delighted that Neil, I and others have been supporting them in their industrial action that is only right, because it's not simply about wages. It's also about health and safety. When you see the cuts are coming to the rail network, as somebody who uses it regularly going up in the road, it's worrying and it's frightening. But I got a meeting for myself and RMT representatives with the lead at the Crown Office, that was kindly provided by the Lord Advocate, with the head of health and safety and who deals with the fatal accident units. And I was very happy to hear that investigations are ongoing. You'll remember last time, because this was not attached to an offshore turbine, it was a supply ship, the legislation that covers oil and gas supply doesn't apply. And accordingly, when the man's life was lost in a tragedy that raised suspicions for Police Scotland, they thought something should be done. But health and safety don't really have the powers. The powers, as I told you last time, the powers rest with the country that is the flag of convenience, frankly, for the ship upon which he was operating. That gentleman who died was on a ship 100 miles off Aberdeen heading for Dundee, but it was flagged by Liberia. Had it not been Liberia, it might have been Panama or the Cayman Islands, as many of them are. So the lead investigation is not health and safety or the Crown. The lead investigation is Liberia. And I was interested to hear in the discussion with the very able, and to be fair to them, I've got no criticism of what Crown are doing within the limited powers they have. They advised me there had been a Teams meeting in which Liberia had participated from Houston, to which I had to caveat, Texas, not Renfrewshire, to which they said, of course. It's not even that Liberia attends itself. It sends attorneys, not even physically, but through the medium of Teams, from the Lone Star State to investigate the death of a worker on a Scottish offshore rig. That is simply unacceptable. I don't criticise Police Scotland or the Crown, but as with a column in Fishing News, the Scottish Government and the SNP are sadly absent. There's another update to make, because despite that tragedy, as I pointed out in the papers that you've seen about our wealth and that Neil again correctly referred to, we're sending 35 terawatts south. I think the last occasion I had to tell you that I had to look up what a terawatt was. 1 billion kilowatts. And we'll be sending 124 billion kilowatts south come 2030. And what are we getting for it? As Neil said, zero, zip, nothing. Of course, the SNP pledged us supply chain jobs. Well, I can say in East Lothian, where it's coming ashore at Cockenzie and indeed at Torness because of connections to the national grid, the supply chain jobs stand at the moment at a precise total of 0. I asked Alan Brown, who's a very friendly guy, the SNP member for Kilmarnock, and who actually is very knowledgeable about energy and thinks I'm just too harsh in the Scottish Government, how many supply chain jobs he's had in Kilmarnock. He hasn't answered me, so I assume it's 0. Of course, there's the odd one here or there. We hear about announcements coming from Japan, and I very much welcome that. But every estuary in Scotland should be building these turbines, not having the nonsense that the closest we're going to get to is probably 20 or so being built up in Nig, and then we'll be assembling them in Leith. And that's another sham, because we're told that the reason that they restricted the auction that I told a few conferences back where most people who hold an auction put a floor price, the SNP put a cap, which is why we got 700 million that they lauded, the former First Minister, and the New Yorkers 4 weeks later got $4.3 billion for 1/4 of what we sold for £700 million. Ireland's actually going through an auction at the moment. The Consul General tells me they won't be imposing a cap on the stuff that's going to go off Kildare, Galway, or wherever else. So it's huge wealth out there that we are simply not accessing. There was a slight error in the figures that we put out, and that's why, if you are looking or refer to papers, please look at the updated papers that Robert Reid will have got on site, because it wasn't our error, it was an error from the House of Commons Library. It transposed figures and it slightly overestimated the value. But fear not, the value in current terms, as at 2030, of that 124 billion kilowatts will be almost £11 billion. That's at current terms. What will it be in 2030 if we continue on the path of the inflation that we currently get? What will it be in 2030 as energy prices continue to rise for fossil fuels, despite them using our assets and exploiting them as fast as they possibly can? And let's also remember, even that 11 billion, that's on an annual and repeating basis. And that's predicated on what we anticipate currently coming in, when we all know that even the current Scotland auction, there's much, much more. We have the huge resource, probably the largest resource of any single country in the European Union for on and offshore wind, and we should be exploiting it, and our people are getting nothing. Which leads me to the latest scandal. Alec correctly mentioned the scandal of people's doors basically being kicked in to have smart meters. Modern IT is supposed to liberate you. Looking back at the first point about the finances, I recall when I was SNP Treasurer, Joan Knott, the lovely Joan Knott that many will remember, had to take a taxi along at the end of the month to get me to sign the cheque to pay the staff wages. Now, of course, it's all done electronically. There's IT systems and transfers. That saves the party a taxi fee. It makes life easier. But new technology is supposed to benefit us and enhance us. And yet a smart meter being imposed upon your house when you've got no funds and no ability to pay isn't making life easier. It is that euphemism of people having self-disconnection, not switching on. Nobody switched them off. No ogre in a power company shut them down. No heartless Tory minister failed to provide them the funds. What happened was they didn't have the money, they couldn't afford the bill, and they simply couldn't put it on. That was shameful. But let me tell you about the latest scam and shame that you'll be reading about and hopefully seeing on STV in coming days or weeks. We all know that it was dreadful for people when they looked at rising electricity and gas prices. But they didn't rise half as fast as those who were having to use what's known as alternative fuels, because those who were having to use heating oil or were having to get in LNG or other Calor gas type projects, They realised that actually the rise in gas and electricity was small beer in comparison to what they were facing. And so after great pressure, after all the pressure that was put on myself and energy campaigners, eventually in December of 2022, they announced they were going to make a payment of £200, the alternative fuel payment. The £200 of alternative fuel payment was paid out in February of 2023. Probably the coldest, most inclement month of the year in Scotland and all these northern parts of Scotland, because that's where I act here. How did they pay it out? Well, at that stage, you didn't write in to try and make sure they got it out because they knew they had been belated. People were freezing and they had to do something. They supplied the energy companies with the meter documentation that they had. They provided that to them and they paid out. Now, that wasn't those who had electricity heating. It was those who basically had an electricity supply. The odd person who didn't perhaps have the electricity supply from the grid, who perhaps had their own generator, they actually had to apply themselves, and they did have to make a declaration that it was their principal home. For everybody else, it went to British Gas, it went to SSE, it went to all of them. It didn't say only pay those who it's their principal home. They just said pay these people. That was what happened in off-gas grid properties. Now, off-gas grid in Scotland, we know, those areas that are off-gas grid are the areas with the highest rates of fuel poverty. The off-gas grid areas in Scotland are the likes of Orkney, Shetland, the Western Isles, Highlands, Moray, Argyll and Bute, Dumfries and Galloway. Never mind those in the urban areas in Glasgow and Dundee and multi-storey flats, because you can't get the gas into the multi-storey flat. But in the off-gas grid areas, the energy companies were directed to pay out. But as well as being the areas with the highest fuel poverty, they're the areas with the highest concentration of second home ownership. They're the areas with the highest concentration of vacant properties. So we had the perversity that the people were huddling at home, unable to heat their bills. But those who had a holiday home and maybe lived either in the central belt or down in Surrey or the south of England, they got bunged £200 to their account. The areas with the highest fuel poverty, the areas with the highest second home ownership, saw money go willy-nilly that should have been targeted to the locals that need it, but instead saw it go across the board to those in holiday homes at a time of year when they wouldn't even have been there. That is a shameful error. That's why it all comes back to the campaign for independence. These mistakes are being made. Sadly, having a Scottish Parliament hasn't allowed us to ensure that mistakes aren't continued to be made because of the Butte House Agreement and the failures. But at the end of the day, without independence, you can't do anything. We require independence to be able to change these things that are coming fundamentally from London, but equally being added to by insanity and perversity in the Scottish Government. It's for that reason that we continue the battle, as Neil said, in Westminster, but equally, when we're not in the ring in Westminster, we're dodging around the communities in Scotland, we're networking people, making contacts, and continuing that push for independence.